I'd like to begin just by going back to the mid-19th century of the United States, to kind of a remarkable debate and a remarkable moment that happened. In the years before the start of the American Civil War, a furious debate broke out among American abolitionists about whether the US Constitution should be interpreted as a tool of freedom and liberation, or whether the Constitution should be denounced as an evil document, an evil compact that sanctioned human slavery. My book, Glorious Liberty, Frederick Douglass and the Fight for an Anti-Slavery Constitution, chronicles the life and times of perhaps the central figure in this momentous constitutional debate. Today, Frederick Douglass is mostly remembered for his courageous and inspiring life story. Now, that is merited, of course. His remarkable odyssey from slavery to freedom shines a searing and unforgettable light on some of the worst and best aspects of American history. But Frederick Douglass deserves to be remembered for much more than that. He deserves to be remembered as a significant political and legal thinker in his own right, as someone who spent the better part of his life grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of rights, the role of government, questions that are really still very important to us today. So for that reason, my book places Douglass's constitutional thought at the forefront of his extraordinary life and career, following how his fight for an anti-slavery constitution helped to shape the course of US history in the 19th century and beyond. One of my goals was to show that Frederick Douglass deserves to be ranked right alongside Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, people like that in the pantheon of American civic philosophers. So let's dive right into the story. And I'm going to start at a very specific date and a remarkable day in American history. On May 9th, 1851, the leading lights of the abolitionist movement gathered in Syracuse, New York, for the 18th annual meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Among the items on the agenda of the Society's agenda that day was a resolution calling for the Society to officially recommend, to give its endorsement to a bunch of anti-slavery publications. Among them was a small weekly newspaper called the Liberty Party paper. But William Lloyd Garrison, the powerful editor of The Liberator, one of abolitionism's flagship publications, well, Garrison would have none of that. He objected immediately. And he objected because the Liberty Party paper, in his view, essentially had endorsed a heresy. It had said that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, and that was tantamount to heresy in Garrison's mind, because Garrison saw the Constitution as a, quote, covenant with death and an agreement with hell. He said it was dripping with human blood. Well, after that objection, a new resolution was quickly proposed and accepted by the Society, which was that only those publications that towed the Garrisonian line would be officially endorsed. Well, it was at this point that Frederick Douglass stood up. An escaped former slave, an internationally acclaimed orator, and the author of a widely celebrated autobiography, Douglass cut a commanding figure in the abolitionist ranks. And for the previous 10 years, he had been a friend, an ally, even a self-declared disciple of William Lloyd Garrison. Every week the Liberator came, Douglass later said, and every week I made myself master of its contents. I not only liked, I loved this paper and its editor. But Douglass no longer loved what Garrison had to say about the Constitution. In fact, he now thought that Garrison was dead wrong on the subject. What is more, Douglass had decided that the time had finally come for him to say so in public. He felt honor-bound to announce at once, this is what he told the assembled abolitionist worthies at the convention. He felt honor-bound to announce at once that the paper he edited, the North Star, no longer possessed the requisite qualification for their official approval and commendation. Here's what he told them. The Constitution should be wielded in behalf of emancipation. Well, those words went down about as well as might have been expected given the audience. Simply put, all hell broke loose at the convention. There were howls of outrage, cries of censure. Garrison accused Douglass of harboring ulterior, meaning financial motives. There is roguery somewhere, Garrison shouted. Now, Douglass never quite forgave his old comrade for that cheap shot. In truth, Frederick Douglass had agonized over his change of opinion. He came around only gradually and only after much brooding. He forced himself to rethink the whole subject, he said, and to study with some care not only the just and proper rules of legal interpretation, but the origin, design, nature, rights, powers, and duties of civil government, and also the relations which human beings sustain to it. Those studies of Douglass's began to bear fruit as early as 1849. Writing in the North Star on March 16th of that year, Douglass said that the Constitution is not a pro-slavery instrument when interpreted standing alone and construed only in the light of its letter. For him, the problem came when he considered the pro-slavery opinions of the men who framed and adopted it. How to reconcile the text of the Constitution with the pro-slavery intentions of the Founding Fathers. This is what he's talking about, he's grappling with here. A year later, in April 1850, Douglass moved a little further away from the strict Garrisonian position. The Constitution, he now said, is at war with itself. Both liberty and slavery are in the Constitution. Now, both liberty and slavery, the imperious Garrison, he did not like the sound of that. Furthermore, Douglass ventured, if we adopt the preamble to the Constitution, with its soaring language about securing the blessings of liberty, well, that language in the preamble makes it even harder to sustain a pro-slavery reading on the rest of the document. Douglass also noticed something else. He noticed that Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, and the slaveholders both had the same idea about the Constitution. They both saw the Constitution as pro-slavery. Garrison sees in the Constitution precisely what John C. Calhoun sees there, Douglass wrote. John C. Calhoun, senator from South Carolina, was perhaps the most famous and important pro-slavery theorist of them all. Garrison and Calhoun both thought the Constitution protected slavery. Well, maybe Garrison and Calhoun were both wrong, Douglass started to think. Maybe the Constitution might stand for something else. He kept poring over the document, poring over its text, poring over its meaning. Soon Douglass would look at the Constitution and decide that the text, just the text by itself, just the text, contained nothing that was actively friendly towards slavery. Blot slavery from existence, he said, and the whole framework of the Constitution might remain unchanged. Douglass then went even further, adopting the argument of a radical abolitionist lawyer named Lysander Spooner, whose 1845 book, The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, had argued that the true test in these matters of constitutional interpretation was whether a court of law, strangers to the prior existence of slavery, could, consistently with legal rules, judicially determine that the Constitution sanctioned slavery. Here is how Frederick Douglass put that in his own words. Suppose a man from another country should read the Constitution with no other knowledge of the character of American institutions than what he derived from the reading of that document. Would anyone pretend that the clause in question would be thought to apply to slaves? We think not. Douglass's close study of constitutional history also started to help him change his point of view. For example, he pointed out, quote, the writings of Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Monroe, Hamilton, Luther Martin, Patrick Henry, John Jay, and a host of other great men, fathers of the Republic. All of their writings contained a variety of anti-slavery sentiments and opinions. Whoever else might have intended that the Constitution should protect slavery, Douglass concluded, there were those among the most illustrious in the country who entertained no such intention. In other words, he started to think maybe the case for the pro-slavery intentions of the Founding Fathers had been overstated. By 1851, his mind was made up. Yes, the Constitution did contain certain oblique references to slavery, such as the notorious 3/5 clause, which said that for purposes of taxation and political representation, state populations would be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons 3/5 of all other persons. But that clause and the handful of others like it spoke only in the ambiguous language of persons. Neither the word slave nor the word slavery appeared anywhere in the text of the Constitution. And that textual absence, Douglass concluded, was a fatal weakness in the slaveholders' position that must be exploited. Take the Constitution according to its plain reading, he insisted. I defy the presentation of a single pro-slavery clause in it. On the other hand, this is Douglass continuing, it will be found to contain principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery. In the years to come, Frederick Douglass would deploy those principles and purposes against slavery until the institution was finally destroyed. This was a momentous and far-reaching decision. Douglass, who had once been William Lloyd Garrison's star pupil and protege, would now break definitively with his former mentor. The anti-slavery movement would never be the same again. As I said earlier, Douglass broke the news to Garrison in person at the annual meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Here was a radical change, in my opinion, Douglass acknowledged. Naturally, he expected that this radical change would cause some controversy, but he was simply unprepared for the extreme vilifications and really ugly personal attacks that followed. You see, the Garrisonians, they did not just denounce Douglass for being wrong in their view. They called him an unprincipled sellout. As far as political divorces go, the Douglass-Garrison split was an ugly one. For a time, the two men, they had labored practically side by side. They had traveled together, shared the same humble lodgings, trod the same stages, faced down the same jeering anti-abolitionist mobs. But they'd also been growing apart philosophically, and the bitter debate over the meaning of the Constitution proved to be the breaking point. It also brought out the worst, it must be said, the worst in William Lloyd Garrison. Let me give you an example of that. His newspaper, The Liberator, contained a section called "The Refuge of Oppression." It was basically a column. It appeared right prominently on the front page of every issue. And this column, this section, contained excerpts and quotations from the pro-slavery press, from pro-slavery writers, all carefully selected by the Liberator so that abolitionists might know the minds of their enemies. Well, after their split, Garrison started to include the writings of Frederick Douglass in this column, The Refuge of Oppression. I mean, in abolitionist circles, this was a very nasty insult. One of Garrison's readers, abolitionist readers, asked him why he did it. Why, this correspondent wrote Garrison in 1853, he placed Douglass's articles in The Refuge of Oppression side by side with the vilest pro-slavery venom from the vilest sheets in the land. Garrison replied that Douglass has, quote, lost much of moral power and will finally lose what remains. To his shame, Garrison was still besmirching, bad-mouthing Douglass in 1860, right as the nation around them was tottering on the brink of civil war. Douglass is thoroughly base and selfish, Garrison complained that year. In fact, Douglass reveals himself more and more to me as destitute of every principle of honor, ungrateful to the last degree, and malevolent in spirit. He is not worthy of respect, confidence, or countenance. I mean, I'll just say that the idea that Frederick Douglass is not worthy of respect is one hot take that has not aged very well. Douglass was, of course, hurt and infuriated by these attacks from his once revered mentor, but he refused to be deterred from his new course. The Constitution is our warrant for the abolition of slavery in every state in the American Union, Douglass said. Equipped with that belief, Douglass would enter the political arena and take the fight directly to the slaveholders. Now let's talk about the slaveholders, the pro-slavery side for a second. I mentioned John C. Calhoun before. Let's talk about Calhoun. He was a crafty politician, but also a sort of a public intellectual of his time. And he had been, by the mid-19th century, he had been at the commanding heights of government power for several decades. He had served as Secretary of War for President James Monroe, Secretary of State for President John Tyler, and as Vice President under both President John Quincy Adams and under President Andrew Jackson. But it was from his perch in the Senate, where Calhoun represented the state of South Carolina, it's from the Senate where Calhoun wielded his greatest influence of all. And then this influence he wielded again and again and again on behalf of slavery. He was unapologetically and unequivocally pro-slavery. Here's what he said. Let me be not misunderstood as admitting, even by implication, that the existing relations between the two races in the slaveholding states is an evil, far otherwise. The relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two, Calhoun said, is instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. He called slavery a positive good. Now, this is an interesting development in the pro-slavery thinking, because at the time of the founding, you would find slave-holding founding fathers such as George Mason, who would at least acknowledge the debasing influence of slavery, and then Mason and others worked to at least sort of partially limit slavery's influence on the national government. Well, Calhoun, he called it a positive good. He would never be caught acknowledging slavery as any sort of necessary evil. He argued that the slaves should be grateful. As for the Constitution, Calhoun argued that it should never be used for any sort of anti-slavery purpose at all. In Calhoun's view, quote, Congress has no power whatever to prevent the citizens of the southern states from emigrating with their property, meaning slaves, into the territory of the United States. Furthermore, he said, neither the inhabitants of the territories nor their legislatures have any such right to stop the spread of slavery. In other words, according to Calhoun, Congress did not even possess the power to prohibit slavery or regulate slavery even in those areas, the federal territories that were under the exclusive control of the federal government. And not only that, Congress had no right to recognize any new state that banned slavery. And Calhoun also thought that the settlers of any new state had no anti-slavery powers of their own. Slavery had to be permanently shielded on every front. And that was not all. Calhoun told the Senate in 1850 that the only way to avoid secession and to save the Union, according to him, was for the North to cease the agitation of the slave question and to provide for the insertion of a provision in the Constitution by amendment that would forever shield slavery from abolitionist influence. But differently, Calhoun wanted to rewrite the Constitution to permanently safeguard, in fact, to prioritize the interests of the slaveholders. Now, unsurprisingly, this audacious scheme attracts the notice of Frederick Douglass. Writing in the North Star a few days after Calhoun had proposed rewriting the Constitution, Douglass mocks Calhoun's plan. He labels it an act of pure desperation. Mr. Calhoun proposes an amendment of the Constitution. How lame and impotent, Douglass wrote. Calhoun must amend or rather deform the Constitution if the slavery side is to prevail. Now, I've been talking about the Constitution here, but there was also the Declaration of Independence to factor in. Was not the entire American system founded on the self-evident truth that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights, such as life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness? Didn't that language just essentially vanquish the case for slavery? Calhoun asked himself that question. He wondered about that too. He's sitting at his desk, he would ponder the Declaration of Independence and ponder its meaning for his beloved slave system. In 1848, Calhoun finally follows his pro-slavery logic to its conclusion, and he denounces the Declaration of Independence and denounces its author, Thomas Jefferson. In fact, Calhoun, he denounces the entire liberal tradition dating back to the English political theorist John Locke, who had argued that government was formed to protect humanity's pre-existing natural rights. According to Calhoun, the notion that all men are created equal is the most false and dangerous of all political errors. It originated with certain writers on government, such as John Locke, who preached the virtues of that unbounded and individual liberty supposed to belong to man. That's Calhoun's word, supposed to belong to man. In Calhoun's view, Locke's liberal philosophy was entirely wrong. The quantum of power on the part of the government, Calhoun wrote, instead of being equal in all cases, must necessarily be very unequal among different people. As for individual liberty or freedom, Calhoun says, it must be subordinate to whatever power may be necessary to protect society. The safety and well-being of society is paramount to individual liberty, according to Calhoun. That is the opposite of the Lockean view. The great mistake of the American Revolution was that Locke's false notion of individual liberty was inserted in the Declaration of Independence, Calhoun says. He looks at history and he says, this mistake is not immediately felt, but it starts to germinate and in time produce what Calhoun calls its poisonous fruits. Now, these poisonous fruits is in fact the rise of an organized abolitionist movement that takes the language of the Declaration of Independence seriously and therefore uses that language against slavery. Frederick Douglass also, like Calhoun, understands that slavery and liberalism are fundamentally incompatible. If you go back to Locke, in his 1681 book, The Second Treatise of Government, he wrote that every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. Frederick Douglass did more than just take those words to heart. He used that concept of self-ownership as the foundation for an all-out attack on the slave system. In his writings and speeches, Douglass would embrace the very liberal principles that Calhoun had spurned. Every man, Douglass said, is the original, natural, rightful, and absolute owner of his own body, and he can only part from his self-ownership by the commission of a crime. In other words, slavery only existed because the enslavers relied on violence, theft, and intimidation to maintain their criminal control over the bodies of the enslaved. These actions violated every principle of the natural rights philosophy, and the slaveholders knew it, which is why pro-slavery thinkers like Calhoun were forced to explicitly repudiate Locke, Jefferson, and the Declaration of Independence. Frederick Douglass made the case for natural rights with particular and memorable force on September 3rd, 1848, when he wrote an extraordinary open letter to his old master, former master, a slaveholder named Thomas Old. Since escaping from Old's control 10 years earlier, Douglass wrote, I have often thought I should like to explain to you the grounds upon which I have justified myself in running away from you. Well, the justification for Douglass was simple. He wrote, you are a man and so am I. In leaving you, I took nothing but what belonged to me and in no way lessened your means for obtaining an honest living. Your faculties remained yours and mine became useful to their rightful owner. This is the natural rights philosophy in a nutshell. Self-ownership, individualism, liberty. In my book, I note that although Douglass is not normally credited as such, he undoubtedly deserves to be ranked as one of the 19th century's foremost proponents of Lockean liberalism. Let's take a moment to just to kind of stop and think about what Calhoun and Douglass have each been saying here about the American system of government. Douglass said slavery could disappear tomorrow, and you don't need to change a word in the Constitution. Calhoun, insisted that the Constitution was and should be pro-slavery, but he also was forced to admit and just to acknowledge the reality that to keep the forces of anti-slavery at bay, the Constitution was going to need to be amended. Douglass said slavery and the Declaration of Independence were simply incompatible, that Jefferson's words supported the abolitionist movement, supported the case for anti-slavery. Well, Calhoun definitely agreed with that, which is why he denounces Jefferson and the Declaration. You look at Calhoun and you see someone distancing himself from the words of the Constitution and distancing himself from the Declaration in order to make his case for slavery. You look at Frederick Douglass, by contrast, and you see someone embracing these founding documents. In fact, Douglass emerges here as a sort of second-generation founding father, as someone urging the nation to finally live up to the principles of liberty and equality contained in the founding documents. Frederick Douglass's case for an anti-slavery constitution began with the Preamble. The Constitution was written, the Preamble said, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. In Douglass's view, every constitutional provision that followed must be interpreted in light of those overarching goals. Furthermore, because the Constitution never once used the words slave or slavery, it was impossible to sustain a pro-slavery interpretation while remaining faithful to the Preamble's liberty-minded objectives, not to mention remaining faithful to the Constitution's overall role as a protector of individual liberty. Interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, Douglass said, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. Now, whether you fully agree with Frederick Douglass about all of that or not, there is no denying the overall force of his legal arguments, and there is absolutely no denying the significant impact those arguments had on the broader anti-slavery movement at the time. That impact is all the more remarkable when you remember that Douglass never held elected office, never even led a winning political coalition. He had his greatest impact as a sort of perennial outsider. He often made common cause with politicians and parties. He worked at various points with the Liberty Party, he worked with the Free Soil Party, and then he worked with the Republican Party. And he eagerly took part in the great political debates and political contests, presidential elections, and so forth, those debates of his time. But his voice always remained that of a radical. He was sometimes supportive and sometimes cajoling, but always he was seeking to push the system in a more thoroughgoing abolitionist direction. In a sense, he served as the conscience of the anti-slavery political movement. And his influence in that role proved to be far-reaching indeed. Throughout the 1850s, as the nation lurched ever closer towards secession and armed conflict, Douglass would make perhaps his greatest impact of all. At a time when the Constitution was at war with itself, as he had once put it, he would help to lead the fight on the side of freedom. Through his words, his actions, and the extraordinary personal example that he set, Frederick Douglass helped to move his country a little bit closer towards liberty. If only more Americans, then and now could say the same thing, we might all be in a better place. Thank you all very much for listening. That's the end of my prepared remarks. I thank you for your attention. I believe there's some time for questions. I would love to hear from you. So yes, thank you again very much.